The Only Road, Chapter 22. Except crossing into the United States would be harder than anything they had gone through in Mexico. Senora Perez said so. Back home, everyone, family, friends, newscasters, agreed. It was night when Senora Perez dropped them off at the migration camp on the outskirts of town. From what they could see in the dark, sheets of metal attached to haphazardly made up structures at the camp. Trash littered the ground. Her rifle lay propped next to the gear shift. "I don't want to leave you here," she said. She reached for the door and hit the power locks, even though she'd already done it 15 minutes before. It was on the map. Jamie glanced through his sketchbook to make sure. He could feel the vibration of Vita's growl against his arm. The map with shelters for immigrants. "Do you know a better place?" Angela licked her dry, chapped lips. Senora Perez shook her head. "I live on a ranch in the desert. I don't get visitors." Jamie and Angela communicated via one of their silent looks. Like on most of their journey, they had no choice. Angela unlocked the door while Jamie kissed the driver. "We wouldn't have made it without you," he said, as he slid across the seat to get out. "We owe you our lives," Angela agreed, as she set Vita on the ground. She blessed them, they slammed the door shut, and in an instant the sound of power locks clicked. From the narrow cab behind the truck's main seats, the twin babies began to cry. As soon as Senora Perez drove away on the dusty path, both to the actual roads, people crawled out from the misshapen buildings like cockroaches. Young men with bulging muscles and red eyes, older men with barrel chests and untrustworthy smiles, all of them offering passage into El Norte. All promising they were the most efficient, reliable, and cheapest. Vita's hackles raised as she growled at each man presenting his border-crossing deal. $2,500, 32,000 pesos, $5,000 per person, and I guarantee your safety. Jamie and Angela told everyone who offered their services they'd think about it. It was impossible to choose one. They didn't know who to trust, and Vita didn't seem to like any of them. Jamie remembered what Xavi had said after they met in El Gordo about the ignorant praying more. But even with all these different prices presented to them, every single one of the smugglers, or coyotes as they're called, wanted more money than Tia had sewed into their jeans, even with the money they hadn't paid Santos back in La Shira. "Call your parents. Get them to wire the fee," one coyote suggested. Jamie didn't have to look at Angela to know that wasn't an option. Their parents had already borrowed all the money they could to get them this far. Besides, in order to collect any money sent, they'd need identification, something they didn't have. "Have your parents send the money directly to me," said another coyote, who had the small, weedy look of Jamie's former friend Felgita back at home. Jamie got the feeling that if they had money sent to this coyote, they'd never see him again. One man even yelled at them that since there were two of them, he'd only charge them $1,000 each to get to the border, but not to help them cross it. They issued a flat-out "no gracias" to that offer. They were already at the border. They weren't going to pay for someone to take them a few kilometers up or down into a different part of it, especially when crossing it. Wherever they were was the most dangerous part. "Boys, boys, let the poor runts get settled in." A tall boy, not too much older than Jamie, emerged from the narrow pathways of the migration camp in heavy combat boots. The coyotes vanished between the falling down shacks and spewed litter as quickly as it had appeared. Although the boy was dressed in camouflage pants, shirt, and a wedge cap with a pistol resting on his hip, Jamie knew this was no junior law enforcement officer. Only one kind of person made crooks scurry away that fast, and it wasn't the police. This boy was a member of whatever gang that controlled the migration camp. "I'll show you where you can stay," the boy grunted. His voice sounded as if he had only changed a few weeks ago, and he still was getting used to its new sound. They had no choice but to move from the dirt track where Senora Perez had dropped them off and follow him. Vida kept to their feet, hackles raised, and turned her nose and pricking her one ear in one direction to the other. At least she wasn't growling anymore. Still, Jamie scrunched, shoulders didn't relax. The boy left them at a shack made more of cardboard than metal. 7 other people sat huddled inside. When Jamie asked Angela if she thought they were safe to stay there, he received a roar of laughter from the inhabitants. La Meguera doesn't come here, if that's what you mean, said a Mexican man with a head that looked like an anvil and squashed. But that's because this area is run by Diamantes. Another Mexican, this one with a nose that looked like it had been broken more than once, continued, the coyotes pay the gang to cut off the crossing fee to let them do business with us. Junior Diamantes members come by all the time to sell drugs. But other than that, they leave us alone, just as long as you don't cause them any trouble. Jamie and Angela glanced at each other. They didn't for a second believe the Del Montes would leave them alone for too long. They'd have to figure out how to cross, and fast. When Angela didn't say anything, Jamie took a deep breath and asked the question himself. Which one of those coyotes is any good? None of them, 2 or 3 answered at once. I've been here for 4 weeks, the man with a grizzled beard and South American accent explained. And it seems half of the people these dimwits take across get caught on the other side. The others wash up downstream with a bullet in their head. If you can, go to Conjo. He's the cheapest of the good ones, one Salvadoran man agreed. I paid another coyote only to end up right back here a week later, half dead from dehydration and poorer than dirt. I wish I had saved more then and paid Conjo the higher price first. Conjo's clients don't get caught or sent back as often as the rest. That's because they're killed or they die trying to cross, said a different man who had come from the south, Nicaragua, or maybe even Panama. No, the Salvadorian slapped his fist to the dirt floor. They don't come back because Conjo's that good. How much does he charge? A Guatemalan woman asked. And how much is he paying you to talk him up? The other man demanded. The Salvadorian looked like he was about to attack the cynical man. For that, I hope your corpse rots in the desert. The kid asked who the best coyote is, so I'm telling him, you son of a gun. He charges $2,100, and that includes the drive to the safe house on the other end. He won't take pesos. Angela and Jamie looked at each other as they huddled in their cardboard corner with Vida on high alert. They couldn't get over how much money that was for one night's work. It took their parents a whole year to earn that amount. But on the other hand, what choice did they have? Going with someone cheaper and less reputable could cost them their lives. In unison, they both let out a sigh. This Conjo did sound better than the others. We'll check him out in the morning, Jamie whispered. Maybe, just maybe, the Salvadorian was mistaken about Conjo's rates. Because if that was what Conjo really charged, they'd never come up with that extra money. Unlike the shifty coyotes in the migration camp, Conjo didn't lurk around seeking business. Customers came to him. Jamie and Angela slept in the morning and waited until the afternoon to follow the directions the Salvadorian man from the cardboard shack had given them to seek out Conjo. Angela's ankle was better, but she still walked with a limp. They went through neighborhoods with decaying walls, where they felt eyes glaring at them through slatted windows, dark alleys with homeless men begging for a coin they could spare, and trash-littered streets with girls wearing very little except empty expressions on their faces. From a shadowed doorway, a man came at them with a knife, but Vida bared his teeth with a growl and the man backed off. They found Conjo munching on peanuts and playing pool against himself in an indoor cantina. just as the Salvadorian man had said. It made sense immediately why this man was called Conjo. Sticking out from his pouchy lips were two large front teeth. His face was long, body slight, and legs lean. He was a bit twitchy like a rabbit, and the slightest noise would freeze to look at different directions. His shoulder-length black hair covered his ears, but Jamie wondered if they were large and twitchy too. $2,200 each, he said, with his back toward them, before they had even reached him. Then the thin desert air made Jamie struggle for enough oxygen. That was $100 more than what they'd been told last night. Each. They might as well find another smuggler because there was no way they could afford him. Jamie tapped Angela's shoulder to go, but his cousin crossed her arms over her chest. She stood her ground with determination he hadn't seen since Sadie disappeared. $2,000 each, since there's two of us. Conjo pocketed the next ball before his nose twitched and he jerked his attention at Vida. Is that thing coming too? Claro, which means clear, Angela affirmed. Are you paying for her crossing fee? Angela put her shoulders back and glared into the rabbit man's amber eyes. She pays her own way by alerting us if anyone is near. Conjo threw a nut on the ground. Vida looked at the food and then at Angela as if waiting for permission to eat it. Angela nodded before Vida gobbled it up with a crunch. Conjo raised both his eyebrows, impressed. $2,200 each, and the dog goes free. Jamie and Angela exchanged looks. Angela gave him a slight nod before glancing at Vida. Jamie sighed and nodded back. Going with Conjo did seem like the best option, and there was the fact that there was the first coyote they'd met, that Vida seemed to like. Do we have your word? Jamie held out his hand like a businessman on the television. Did to seal the deal. $2,200 each. Conjo took his hand and shook it hard without breaking eye contact. Be back here at 10 o'clock sharp, any night except Sunday, with the money. He threw Vida another nut and returned to his game, where he pocketed two balls in one turn. We should just call Tomas. He can come over and hide us in his car to go back, Jamie said the next morning as they walked the streets, with Vida at their heels. They'd spent the night thinking of ways to earn Conjo's extra money. The downtown area, an hour's walk from their camp, seemed like a more promising place to earn money. At least the buildings weren't made of metal sheets and cardboard. But from here, they saw what stood against them, the river with its cemented sides, the giant wall behind it, the armed guards, and all the tall buildings of the promised land that was El Paso, Texas, the rest of the United States. All so close. Jamie could throw a stone and have it fall into the other country. But unless he were a stone, getting there was near impossible. And if they catch us crossing in Tomas's car, they send us back to Guatemala and throw Tomas in jail for smuggling, Angela said. She was right. He knew that. But he hated having come all this way just to face a dead end, especially when he thought about how close they were. Tia had said there was about $2,000 in each of their jeans, which meant they were $200 shy of Conjo's fee, each. He came up to the same question they'd asked the night before. So how are we going to earn extra money? Maybe I can get a job as a nanny, Angela said, as she noticed a dark-skinned woman pushing a stroller with a blonde toddler. Shouldn't we talk to her? Or should we talk to her? Jamie asked. But before they could ask the babysitter if she knew of any extra jobs, the pair had disappeared into the crowd. A huge sigh escaped them both, hopeless. The people who could afford a nanny in this town probably lived behind security-guarded gates. In his head, Jamie went through his abilities. Thanks to Senora Perez, he was better at swinging a hammer, but not skilled enough that people would actually pay him. And the mercado in La Shira, the merchant had paid him in rotting fruit for carrying boxes. He knew without asking that Conjo wouldn't accept squashed papayas as payment. If Xavery were here, he'd figure something out, Angela muttered. Vita's ears pricked at the name. Angela scooped up the dog and buried her face in the white and brown patched hair. Jamie stopped next to her, his hand on her shoulder. Yes, Xavier would have thought of something. He was good at taking charge, like Maguel. What would they have done? Jamie glanced through his sketchbook at the picture of Maguel's funeral. An idea started taking shape. Without the cover, the front sheets were bending and curling, but the blank ones toward the back were still in good condition. The old woman on the bus had paid him 12 pesos for his drawing, even though she had been poor. Would other people pay him to sketch their portraits? He counted 20 sheets of paper left in the book. His last pencil was almost at its full length, but since his sharpener had been stolen with his bag, he'd have to chip away at the wood by hand. Not ideal, but not impossible. We need to go someplace where all the gringo tourists walk by, he said, his eyes shining with new hope and determination. What do you have in mind? You'll see. They found an empty bench in the huge park with paved paths, irrigated grass, and shade trees. It was near the city center and very close to the border, and very far from the ugly camp. The day was cloudless and hot, but not too hot to keep people indoors. Jamie began to set up shop. First, he tucked in his frayed t-shirt, which he'd cut to tie the brace for Angela's ankle, and brushed off his dirt-covered jeans as best he could. Then he used the back of his used page to draw portraits of each corner of 4 famous people everyone could recognize: Jennifer Lopez, Jesus Christ, President Obama, and Mickey Mouse. He held out the sketchbook with one hand and his pencil in the other. Every time someone passed by their bench, he waved his pencil as if he were drawing in the air and pointed to his sketchbook. Me make you? Me make you? He asked each person. He wished he knew more English, but that was the best he could say. Angela couldn't remember how to say draw or even paint in English, so he wasn't able to help with his vocabulary. Instead, she mended the large rip in her jeans. If Abuela had been there, she would have been scandalized that Angela had gone around the whole state showing so much leg. Vida lay down at their feet and gave every passerby a hopeful one-ear look. Most people ignored Jamie, but finally he noticed a group of girls a bit older than Angela. The one in front with long blonde hair and skin browned by the sun carried a bag with the face of Frida Kahlo, one of Mexico's famous artists. If this blonde gringa liked Frida, maybe she'd like her portrait sketched. Me make you? Make you como Frida. He pointed to her bag with his pencil, and then at his sketchbook. She stopped and looked at him, then at the simple sketch of the famous people. She asked a question he didn't understand while rubbing her fingers together. That he understood. She wanted to know how much. Thing, he said, and he wanted to charge more. Poor people on the bus paid 12, but 10 was the highest he could count in English. She nodded and smiled as she sat down on the bench. Sure. He took his time outlining her face before filling in her features. Her eyes were small, but her cheekbones and smile highlighted her face, making her very pretty. He ignored the pimple on her forehead, but made sure to include her beaded, dangling earrings. She sat still with her chin up like a perfect model during the time it took to draw her. He couldn't have asked for a better subject, and as a result, the drawing turned out really well. He wished he could keep it for himself. He remembered to sign the bottom with his illegible autograph before handing her the portrait. She broke into a wide grin that had him smiling back in an instant. He knew the words fantastic and beautiful, and took it to mean she liked it. Then she asked him something he didn't understand. Tu anos? She asked again, and comprehension suddenly hit him. She wanted to know how old he was. Tain, and tu? He said, holding out 10 fingers. And then 2 more. 12? He nodded in hope that what she'd said was correct. She carefully rolled up the portrait and pulled off a spare hand from her wrist to hold the shape. Then she dug into her bag for her wallet. Instead of the 10 peso coin he was expecting, she handed him a crisp United States note, green with blue watermarks, and the number 20 on each corner. No, Dane! He held out his hands, showing her again his 10 fingers. She shook her head no and waved him away as if it was nothing. How could anyone think $20 was nothing? She had given him more than 15 times what he had asked. She must be very rich. Tanku, he said. He couldn't make the TH sound, and he knew she understood. He stared at the note for a second longer before tucking it deep into his pocket. It wasn't until then that he noticed Angela had convinced one of the portrait lady's friends to let her reattach her shirt button that had come loose. She handed back the shirt and was given a few bills in return. Once the group had left, Angela showed her earrings. $3. I didn't ask for any price. That's just what he gave me, Angela explained. She tried not to look disappointed. We must accept and be grateful for whatever we can get. They were discussing how to get their next clients when a brown-haired woman with pale skin who had been watching stormed up to them, demanding something. They looked at each other nervously. She was accusing them of stealing. She let out an exasperated sigh and then pointed to Angela's mended jeans, pinched her thumb and forefinger, and shook the shirt she wore up and down. I think she wants you to sew her skirt, Jamie said, or else she's afraid of caterpillars going up her legs. Angela smiled with a nod and pulled out her sewing kit. It's a lucky thing I still have this, she said, and Jamie knew she'd forgiven him for losing the backpacks on the train. The new gringa made cutting motions with her fingers and pointed to where she wanted the alterations. Angela folded the skirt in position and confirmed before making the cut with their micro scissors. The lady stood there in the middle of the park, looking at her phone while Angela tried not to poke her legs with a needle. Me make you $10, Jamie called out. He didn't think he could say 12, but now that was changing. Now he was changing his rate from pesos to dollars. That was good enough. People paused to look at Angela fashioning a skirt still on the lady. An old couple stared first at Angela, the woman nodding her approval of Angela's technique before turning to Jamie, who pointed from his portrait to sample them. $10. 5, her husband said as she pushed his thick glasses. Si, yes, Jamie agreed, even though the old man's gold watch implied he could pay more. Like Angela had said, they had to accept whatever they could get. Jamie drew the couple sitting together, the lady with the wide fake smile and her husband scowling as his face had frozen that way many years ago. The sketch turned out well, but Jamie didn't have any problem giving it up. The old man grumbled, but handed him $10. Maybe they figured because there were 2 of them, the price was for each of them. This time, Jamie didn't correct them. He took what he got. By now, 2 children were posing for photos with Vida. Her missing an ear made the children exclaim, "How cute!" a million times. They fed her their ice creams and pork rinds, while Jamie tried not to be jealous. He and Angela hadn't eaten anything today. Everything they earned, they needed for the crossing. When the parents said it was time to leave, the children began jumping up and down, whining and begging their parents for something. Jamie couldn't help but think he and his cousins back home never acted like that. The father, who spoke decent Spanish, turned to Jamie. My children love your dog. How much for her? She's not for sale, Angela said with a needle in her mouth. 1,000 pesos. The father raised his eyebrows as if daring them to refuse. Jamie wasn't sure of the conversion rate, but he knew it was a good amount toward their crossing fee. Absolutely not, Angela confirmed, her eyes never leaving her job. The father looked at Jamie as if he would try to convince the stubborn seamstress. Jamie lifted his shoulders in a shrug as if there were nothing he could do. Secretly, though, he was glad. If Vida hadn't found them under the car in La Shira, they might have never made it this far. If she hadn't caught the rabbit, Senora Perez might not have driven them here. No, Vida stayed. The father sighed but slipped Jamie a 50 peso note for letting his children take doggy selfies. A bit confused, Jamie thanked the family anyway. He couldn't get over how generous all these gringos were, especially when the news always said how they didn't like immigrants. True, he wasn't in their country yet, but it was weird how they expected to pay for everything. He would have never thought of charging people just to take a picture of their dog. The customs were so different from what they were back home. He wasn't sure if he would ever get used to them.